There is something strange about the oldest texts ever written. Not strange in the way of mysteries or secrets. Not strange the way we mean when we say something is eerie. Strange in a quieter way. A more unsettling way. The oldest texts ever written, the ones pressed into soft clay tablets by people who lived more than 4,000 years ago in the flat, hot lands between two rivers, those texts are not optimistic. They don't say, "We have built something, we have achieved, we have conquered the wilderness and made it a garden." They say something else entirely. They say, man is weak. The gods are unpredictable. Fate has already been decided, and there is nothing, truly nothing you can do about it. Let that sit for a moment. The first civilization in human history, the people who invented writing, who first organized cities with streets and laws and temples, who first kept records and counted grain and drew maps of the stars, those people looked at everything they had made and said, "It won't be enough," not out of despair, not out of defeat, simply because they believed it was true. This is what we're going to sit with tonight. Not the glories of Sumer, not the monuments, or the kings, or the impressive inventory of firsts. We're going to sit with something quieter and more permanent than any of that. We're going to sit with the thought that was already there, already pressed into clay, already waiting, even before there were enough people to fully remember it. The thought that says, the world is not designed for your happiness, and the strange, almost unbelievable thing, the thing worth staying awake for one more moment to consider, is this. Maybe that understanding, that cold, clear-eyed understanding, is the reason they built anything at all. Settle in. Dim whatever light you have. Let the day behind you go wherever days go. When they're finished, let your body grow heavy the way it does when you finally give it permission. Your shoulders, your jaw, the muscles behind your eyes that have been holding something all day without you quite noticing. Let them rest. Tonight we go back, a long way back, to a city at the edge of a river, under stars so bright they had names for all of them, to a world where the first humans to ever write anything down wrote, almost immediately, about the certainty of sorrow. We don't need to hurry. There's nowhere to be. We'll take our time getting there. You are going to hear about people who are not so different from you. People who woke up before they wanted to, who worried about money and status and whether the gods or the universe, or whatever name you give to the enormous, indifferent thing above you, were paying attention. People who worked very hard every day and wondered quietly if it would ever be enough. People who built extraordinary things and then watched them fall, or watched their children watch them fall, or simply trusted that they would fall eventually, because everything falls eventually. And this, too, was something they had thought about carefully. We don't know all their names. Most of their names are gone. That too is part of the story. But tonight, we'll stay with them for a while. We'll watch their city wake up. We'll sit inside their thinking. We'll follow one thread of their understanding, this cold, almost severe resignation to the way things are. And we'll follow it all the way to where it touches us. Right here, right now, in the dark, wherever you are, with the day finally behind you. You don't have to do anything with what you hear tonight. You don't have to learn it. You don't have to remember it. You don't have to reach any conclusion or arrive anywhere in particular. Just listen. Just breathe. Let it move through you the way a river moves through flat land. Slowly, silently, without needing permission. We begin. The city of Ur, southern Mesopotamia. approximately 2100 BCE. The land here is almost perfectly flat. The flatness isn't beautiful exactly. It's more fundamental than that. It's the flatness of a world that has been worked for 10,000 years. A flatness of human making as much as geological fact. Canals run in straight lines across this landscape, carrying water from the Euphrates to fields that would otherwise be desert. The canals are the veins of this world. Without them, there is no city. Without them, there is nothing at all. This morning, and it is very early, before the sun has done more than suggest itself at the horizon, the canal that runs along the eastern edge of the city is still. The water is the color of pale clay. A reed warbler somewhere in the tall papyrus along the bank is the only thing making a sound. Its song is small and repetitive and does not seem directed at anything in particular. It simply continues, the way small things continue when the world hasn't decided yet what it's going to do with the day. The city of is waking up, not quickly, not with any drama, the way a person wakes up when they are very tired, and the day ahead is not a good one. Slowly, with effort, with a kind of resignation that begins before consciousness has fully returned. The first thing you notice, if you were to stand at the edge of the city right now, is the smell. It is not the smell of flowers or fresh bread or any of the things we associate with pleasant mornings. It is the smell of damp mud, of bitumen, the black, sticky substance that seeps naturally from the earth here, used to seal boats and waterproof walls, and hold the very bricks of the city together. Of dung fires beginning to smolder as the first households kindle their morning heat. Underneath all of that, something organic and deep, like the earth itself exhaling, is the smell of a city built entirely from what the ground gave up. No stone to speak of, no timber of any real quantity, clay, reed, bitumen, and fire. That is what this city is made from. That is what it smells like before sunrise. The streets are narrow, narrower than you might imagine. Two people can pass each other comfortably, but a cart pulled by a donkey takes up almost the entire width. And when a cart is coming, you press yourself against the wall and wait. The walls are mud brick, smoothed but not polished, warm to the touch even in early morning because the sun has spent all of yesterday baking them through. They hold that warmth through the night and release it slowly, so that walking through the alleys of at dawn is walking through something that still remembers yesterday, as if the past is always just barely present here, just under the surface of things, warm and waiting. Above you, if you look up between the walls of the alley, the sky is still deeply dark in the west and beginning its slow lightening in the east. The stars are extraordinary. Out here, with no competing light, the Milky Way is not a suggestion, but a fact. A dense river of light so bright it seems almost too much, almost aggressive in its abundance. Too many stars to mean anything in particular, which is exactly how the Sumerians felt about it. Something enormous, full of meaning, impossible to fully read. They tried, though. They tried harder than almost anyone. The houses are small, by any modern measure. Most families live in a few rooms, arranged around a central courtyard open to the sky. The courtyard is the heart of the house, the place where cooking happens, where children play, where the household shrine sits in its corner, with its small clay figurines of gods and ancestors, watching the comings and goings of daily life with their wide painted eyes. At night, in summer, people sleep on the flat roof, under the open sky, where the air is slightly cooler and the stars are close enough that you could almost convince yourself they care about you. In winter, they sleep inside, on reed mats, pressed close together for warmth. The dung fire banked low, the smell of smoke and animal fat and human bodies all mixed together in the dark. And the night is long and very quiet and cold in a way that surprises you every year, even though it comes every year. This is not poverty exactly. This is just life. This is what life is, here and now. In the year 2100, before the Common Era, in the most sophisticated city in the known world. Let that sit for a moment too. The most sophisticated city in the known world looks like this, smells like this, sounds like this. The reed warbler, the distant lowing of cattle from the pens near the temple storehouse, the first creak of a wooden door somewhere in the alley, a child coughing twice and then going quiet, a dog shaking itself awake and settling back down. The sophistication is not in the comfort. It is in the systems, the canals that make agriculture possible in a desert, the storehouses that hold the city's grain reserves against bad years, the temple, the great ziggurat that rises at the city's center like a stepped mountain made by human hands, which is not merely a place of worship, but also a redistribution center, a bank, an archive, a seat of administration. The scribes who work in the temple complex, pressing small wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets with a triangular reed stylus, are not doing something abstract and distant from daily life. They are recording how much barley went in, how much came out, who owed what to whom, what the king decreed about property disputes, what the omens said about the coming season. This is the world's first bureaucracy. And underneath it, pressing up against it from every direction, through every crack in every mud brick wall, is the oldest human question, still unanswered. Why is it this hard? At the edge of the market district, we'll get there soon, but we're not hurrying. There is a scribe school. In Sumerian, it is called the Eduba, the House of Tablets. Boys come here in the morning carrying their clay tablets wrapped in cloth to learn writing and mathematics and the long lists of words and texts that constitute education in this world. The teachers are strict, the curriculum is relentless. Sumerian education has preserved in remarkable detail the complaints of students, small, human, instantly recognizable complaints, pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, and surviving perfectly intact. The teacher beat me because my tablet wasn't clean enough. My homework was wrong and I was punished again. I am so tired. There is something almost unbearably touching about this. The world's first complaints about school, the world's first exhausted student pressing his tired stylus into wet clay, wishing he were somewhere else. He doesn't know, how could he, that 4,000 years from now, someone will read those words and feel something that isn't quite nostalgia and isn't quite pity, but is somewhere in between. A recognition, a small, quiet shock of being seen across an impossible distance. I am so tired. 4 words, 4,000 years. This is what Sumer keeps doing to us. It keeps showing us ourselves. The market begins to wake around the same time as the scribe school. The market in is not a market the way we think of markets, a temporary thing, a weekly gathering, a place you visit and then leave. It is permanent, dense, continuous, a kind of living organism that breathes and shifts with the seasons and the trade routes. Merchants here deal in things that have come extraordinary distances. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, the deep blue stone used for temple decorations, and the jewelry of the wealthy. the color of a sky that doesn't exist in flat Mesopotamia. Copper from the mountains to the north, diorite for statues, carnelian from what is now India, silver from regions far away whose names we barely know. Ur is a port city, sitting near where the Euphrates once met the Persian Gulf. The shoreline was much closer then, and ships come in loaded with goods from places that would seem mythological to most people living here. In exchange, Ur sends out wool, cloth, grain, oil, the durable things, the things the flat land grows. The merchants who manage this trade are not at the top of Sumerian society. The king is at the top, then the high priests, then the scribes and officials, then the merchants, then the craftsmen and farmers, then the laborers, then the slaves, often prisoners of war, or people so deep in debt they have sold themselves or been sold by someone else. This is the order of things. Not because someone sat down one day and decided it should be this way. It has simply always been this way, as far as anyone in Ur can remember. The temple has always had its share. The king has always had his. The canal has always needed maintenance, which means the laborers have always had their work, season after season, regardless of whether they want it, regardless of whether they're well, regardless of whether the season is good or bad or somewhere in between. There is a Sumerian proverb that has survived. It says, "Poverty is hard to break out from, but wealth is constantly fleeting." One sentence, one ancient sentence from a world so far back it barely feels like the same species. And yet you read it and you don't think, how archaic, how different from now. You think, yes, that's the thing about Sumerian proverbs. They keep doing that. By mid-morning, the heat has arrived. In southern Mesopotamia in summer, the heat is not a metaphor or an inconvenience. It is a presence. It sits on the city like a hand pressed down, and there is no negotiating with it, no shade deep enough to fully escape it. People slow their movements without thinking about it. Animals stand in whatever shadow they can find. The canal water, now warmed by the sun, smells more strongly of everything that lives in it. Work continues regardless. The farmers are already in the fields, have been since before dawn. Irrigation management is a constant consuming task. The channels must be maintained, the sluice gates opened and closed at the right times, the levees watched for any sign of weakness. A breach can flood a field and destroy a harvest in hours. A blocked channel can do the same in the other direction. The margin of error is very small. The consequence of error is very large. And beneath all of this, always the knowledge that the river does not care. The river does what it does. In a good year, the floods bring rich silt and refill the irrigation system, and the grain grows tall. In a bad year, the floods come too hard, or too late, or not at all, and then people will be hungry. There is no insurance against this. There is no system robust enough to fully compensate when the river decides to be different. There is only the hope, not expectation, only hope that this year will be a good year, and the knowledge held quietly alongside that hope that it might not be, that the universe does not owe anyone a good year. This is something the Sumerians understood very clearly and very early, and did not spend a great deal of energy arguing with. In the afternoon, when the heat is at its worst, the city quiets. Not completely. The temple never stops entirely. The scribes keep working by the light of small oil lamps. But the pace drops. People find corners of shadow. Dogs lie completely still, panting in that effortful, rhythmic way that makes them sound like small engines. Even the canal seems to slow, though of course it doesn't. Water doesn't slow because of heat, but the light plays off it differently in the afternoon. More heavily, more reluctantly, as if even the river is tired. This is the time of day when a certain kind of thinking happens. Not organized thinking, not the kind the scribes do at their tablets, the precise, careful, wedge by wedge thinking of record keeping. The slow, ambient thinking that happens when the body is tired and the day hasn't yet turned back toward evening. The kind of thinking that wanders without direction and arrives at things you weren't trying to arrive at. What does a Sumerian farmer or craftsman or merchant think about in these slow hours? We can't know directly. We can only know what they wrote down. And what they wrote down, the proverbs, the laments, the poems, the prayers, suggests something. They think about debt. They think about the temple and what they owe it, what they will always owe it, because the temple is the center of the economic world and the center of the religious world, and there is no separation between those things here. No clean line between what you owe God and what you owe the state. They think about their children's futures, whether the eldest son will pass the scribal examinations that are the gateway to a better life, whether the daughter's match will be adequate, whether the second son will find work or become a burden. They think about the harvest. They think about what they did wrong last year and what they might do differently. They think about neighbors, about obligations, and underneath all of that, with a frequency that the texts preserve very clearly, they think about death, not with the frantic urgency of someone who hasn't accepted it, with a different quality of attention, a resigned, almost matter-of-fact attention, the way you might think about the weather. It is coming. It always comes. There is no use pretending otherwise, and pretending otherwise is not something the Sumerians have much patience for. In Sumer, there is no paradise waiting. This is important enough to stay with for a moment. Even here, even in the slow afternoon heat. No reward for good behavior in this life. No heaven. No fields of the blessed. No transformation into something radiant and permanent. When you die, you go to the underworld. The Kur, in Sumerian, the great dark land below, ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, queen of the great below. And the underworld is nothing like what later traditions would invent to make death bearable. It is a dark, dusty place where the dead exist as shadows of what they were, eating clay and drinking bitter water, clothed in feathers like birds, supervised by beings that are neither kind nor cruel, simply efficient. No light, no joy, no purpose, no continuation of anything that made life recognizable as life. It is not punishment. Even a good person, even the most righteous person in all of a person who paid their debts and honored the gods and treated their neighbors fairly and raised their children well, even that person ends up there. The underworld is not a consequence of failure. It is simply the other side of life, the cold, gray, permanent other side. The Sumerian afterlife is not a reward system. It is just where the dead go. And knowing this, as every Sumerian knows this from childhood, hears it in the songs, reads it in the texts, understands it as simply as they understand that the river floods in spring. You wake up in the morning, not because tomorrow will be better, not because the arc of your story is bending towards something good, not because the universe is on your side. You wake up because today is here, and there is work to do, and sleep is the only pause you'll get. That sounds, from where we sit, like despair, but I want to suggest, gently, without arguing about it, that it might be something else. that it might be something very close to clarity. Because when you stop waiting for the universe to reward you, something shifts. The work becomes simpler. The day becomes what it is. The small things, the reed warbler, the warm wall, the smell of dung smoke, and the morning, those things become enough. Not because they're all you have, but because they're what's actually there. The Sumerians didn't wait for good news from the cosmos. They just kept building. Evening comes slowly to Mesopotamia. The heat retreats in stages, as if unwilling to leave entirely. The shadows stretch long and amber across the flat land, and the canals catch the dying light and turn briefly, unexpectedly beautiful, gold and copper, reflecting a sky that has decided, at the last possible moment, to be generous with color even as it refuses to be generous with much else. The city comes back to life. Cooking fires are kindled. The smell of roasting grain and dried fish, and the herbs that grow near the water, coriander, dill, the sharp green smell of things that like to grow close to mud, drifts through the alleys. Children who have been kept inside during the worst of the heat are released and run through the streets in the way that children have always run through streets everywhere, in every civilization and every century, with no particular destination and no need of one. At the temple, the priests are performing the evening rituals. The god who lives at the top of the ziggurat in this is Nana, the moon god, the great and distant silver eye, must be fed and clothed and attended and spoken to. The rituals are elaborate and specific and must be done exactly correctly because the gods are, among other things, exacting. An omitted step, a wrong word, a contaminated offering could turn the god's attention away at exactly the wrong moment. And a god's inattention is not abstract. It can mean a flood, or a drought, or a military defeat, or a plague, or a harvest failure. The stakes of the evening ritual are not symbolic. They are practical and immediate, but even the most perfect ritual is not a guarantee. This is the quietly terrifying truth at the center of Sumerian religious life. You can do everything right and still suffer. The gods can be propitiated and still be absent when you need them. Fate can be read in the stars and in the livers of sacrificed animals and in the behavior of oil poured on water, and still deliver exactly what it had already decided to deliver, regardless of what the omens seem to promise. You cannot, in the end, negotiate with the universe. You can try. The Sumerians tried harder than almost any civilization before or since. They read omens obsessively. They had entire professional classes devoted to the reading of signs. They believed, genuinely and completely, that the cosmos was communicating if you could only learn to listen closely enough. And yet, the texts they left behind, the honest ones, the ones that weren't official propaganda or royal self-congratulation, those texts suggest that even the most devout Sumerian, deep in the honest hours of the night, suspected something, that the universe was speaking, yes, but not to them specifically, that the universe was speaking to itself in a language not designed for human ears, about matters that had very little to do with any individual human life. That individual human lives, with all their work and worry and ritual and love and fear, were, from the universe's perspective, very small, not worthless, not nothing, just small. The city of settles into the evening. The reed warbler has gone quiet. The canal moves in the dark, carrying its clay-colored water between the fields and the city and the distant gulf where the ships are moored, and the sailors are sleeping. The ziggurat rises above everything, its summit lost in the thickening blue of the sky. The god at its top attended and fed and dressed in clean linen, not answering, as gods often are. And the people of go to sleep, not because they are at peace exactly, not because the questions have been answered, or the debts forgiven, or the harvest secured, or the child's future settled, but because they are tired. And sleep is the only reliable mercy the universe has ever consistently offered. The mercy of forgetting for a few hours. The mercy of the dark. Before we can understand what the Sumerians thought about suffering, we need to understand what they thought the world was, not metaphorically, literally. What is the physical structure of existence, according to the people who first wrote things down? The answer is stranger and more precise than you might expect. In the beginning, according to Sumerian cosmology, there was the sea. Not a sea like any sea you have ever seen or imagined. Not blue water with a horizon and waves and the smell of salt. A primordial sea. Dark, undifferentiated, existing before anything else existed, including the concept of before. The Sumerians called this sea Namu, and Namu was not chaos. Exactly. She was something closer to potential, something vast and patient that had not yet decided what to become. From Namu came the sky and the earth, An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth. And from their union came Enlil, the god of air and wind, who separated them, who pushed the sky up and pressed the earth down and made the space between, the space where things can happen, where light can exist, where breath is possible. That space is the world. That gap between sky and earth, held open by a god, is where all of this takes place. This is a remarkable cosmology. Think about what it says. The world is not a gift. The world is not a home built for you. The world is a gap, an opening, a breath held open between two enormous things that would otherwise close together. Your existence and the existence of everything that matters to you happens in this intermediate space, this borrowed space, this space that requires at some level a god's ongoing effort to maintain, not reassuring exactly, but honest. Into this world, into this held open space between sky and earth, the gods placed themselves, and for a very long time, the gods did all the work themselves. This is the part the creation myth spends considerable time on, and it is worth attending to, because it is not the story you're used to. The great gods, Anu, Enlil, Enki, held authority and made decisions, but the work, the actual, physical, daily, grinding work of maintaining the world, the digging of channels, the moving of earth, the tending of crops, the keeping of the systems that sustain life, that work was done by the lesser gods, called the Anunnaki, and the Anunnaki grew tired. They grew very tired. The texts describe this tiredness with remarkable specificity. The lesser gods worked for 40 years, and then for another 40, and then another. And eventually they stopped. They put down their tools, their divine tools, their cosmic shovels and hoes, and they refused to continue. They complained to Enlil. They told him the burden was too great, that the work was without end, that they could not go on indefinitely, that something needed to change. There is something almost funny about this, in a dark way. The gods went on strike. Enlil didn't know what to do. He called a council. Enki, the wise one, the god of water and wisdom and craft, had a solution. Make something to do the work instead. And so, humanity was created. not out of love, not because the universe wanted companionship, not because some divine force looked at the vast world and thought, this needs a witness, a steward, a beloved creature to tend it. Humanity was created because the gods were tired. We were made to be workers, to carry the yoke that the lesser gods could no longer bear, to dig the canals and tend the fields, and press the grain and bake the bread, and present the offerings at the temple, the offerings that sustained the gods, who were apparently not self-sufficient but required feeding and clothing and attending, much as any powerful but demanding employer requires the labor of those beneath them. This is the Sumerian understanding of what human beings are, not the crown of creation, not beings made in the image of the divine and placed in a garden to name the animals and receive dominion over the earth, workers, laborers, creatures made from clay and divine blood, specifically the blood of a god killed for this purpose, whose sacrifice gave humans their intelligence, their restlessness, their divine impatience, but workers nonetheless, made for a purpose that was not their own. And here is the first place where the Sumerian worldview stops being ancient history and becomes something you may recognize. You were made for work. You will work. You will work hard, often without reward proportional to the effort, often without acknowledgement proportional to the sacrifice. The system you are embedded in was not designed with your happiness as its primary goal. It was designed to function, to maintain, to continue. The Sumerians didn't experience this as a tragedy. They experienced it as the basic terms of existence. The contract was never hidden. The clay remembered whose blood had gone into it. The work was not a punishment for some original sin, not a fall from a better state, not something that could be undone if only you found the right path. It was simply what you were for. There is a kind of terrible freedom in this understanding. Once you know what you're for, you stop arguing with it. You stop waiting for the rules to change. You pick up the hoe that the gods put down, and you dig the canal, and you watch the water flow, and you come home tired, and you sleep, and you do it again the next day. But the gods are still there. This is important, and the Sumerians spent an enormous amount of energy navigating it. In Sumerian theology, the gods are not distant abstractions. They are not philosophical concepts or metaphors for natural forces. They are real, present, active, involved, intensely involved in the daily functioning of the world. Every city has a patron deity. Belongs to Nana, the moon god, whose great ziggurat rises at the city's heart as his earthly residence. Nippur belongs to Enlil, Eridu to Enki. The god actually lives there, in the inner sanctum of the temple, in a form maintained by the priests through constant ritual attention, bathed, fed, clothed, spoken to, consulted on important decisions, and each individual person, in addition to the city's patron deity, has a personal god, a divine guardian assigned specifically to them, who walks ahead of them in life, who advocates on their behalf before the greater gods, who is supposed to ensure that their me, their divine decree, their place in the order of things, is maintained. The relationship with your personal God is not metaphorical. It is the most important practical relationship in your life, more important than your relationship with the king or the temple or your family, because your personal God mediates between you and the incomprehensible machinery of fate, and like all important relationships, it can go wrong. The text known as Man and His God, sometimes called the Sumerian Job, because it predates the biblical book of Job by centuries and clearly influenced it, describes exactly this: a man who has done nothing wrong, a good man, a faithful man, finds himself suddenly afflicted. Illness, loss, social humiliation, the silence of his God, who used to be present and now is simply not answering. The man does not rebel. He does not shake his fist at the sky and demand an explanation. He does not lose his faith. He does what the poem recommends. He laments. He weeps. He continues to pray, continues to prostrate himself, continues to describe his suffering in careful, almost clinical detail, because perhaps, if he can explain it clearly enough, if the words are precise enough, if the grief is articulated fully enough, the God will hear and turn back toward him. This is the psychology of the prayer, not petition, not bargaining, articulation, the belief that suffering, properly expressed, might create a path through which divine attention could return. Let my mother stand at my left side. Let my personal God stand at my right. Let the God who has abandoned me return to me. Let the goddess who has turned away from me show her face again. These lines, translated from clay tablets 4,000 years old, sound like things people say now. They sound like things people say in the dark when the sleep won't come and the anxiety is very loud, and the sense of being unprotected, unsupported, inexplicably abandoned by whatever force was supposed to be keeping you safe. That sense is impossible to reason with and impossible to fully dismiss. The Sumerian didn't call it anxiety. He called it the God looking away. The diagnosis is different. The experience is exactly the same. What the Sumerian cosmos does not offer, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, is the belief that suffering is always correctable. The Ludlul Bel Nemeki, the poem of the righteous sufferer, composed around 1700 BCE and thought to have influenced the book of Job, describes a man who has lost everything despite being genuinely righteous. He says, in one of the most extraordinary passages to survive from the ancient world, I have prayed to my God. He did not turn his face to me. I appealed to my goddess. She did not raise her head. The diviner with his inspection has not determined the limits of my suffering. He continues, what is good for oneself may be an offense to one's God. What in one's own heart seems despicable may be proper to one's God. Who knows the will of the gods in heaven? Who understands the plans of the underworld gods? This is the heart of it. Who knows the will of the gods? Not you, not the priests, not the king, not the most learned scribe in the most sophisticated city in the world. The gods have their reasons, and those reasons are not accessible to human understanding. And to assume otherwise, to assume that righteousness will be rewarded, that suffering will be explained, that the universe operates on a principle of justice visible to human eyes, is the precise and specific mistake that Sumerian wisdom literature over and over again, in text after text, on tablet after tablet, gently and firmly corrects. The universe is not a justice system. It is something much larger and much stranger than that. The practical consequence of this understanding was not despair. The Sumerians were not people who gave up. They built their cities and dug their canals and maintained their temples and sent their ships down the river and traded lapis lazuli for grain and grain for copper and copper for diorite, and kept the whole intricate, fragile, improbable system running for hundreds of years. They were not nihilists. They were not passive. They simply separated two things that many other civilizations would later struggle to keep separate: the question of whether the universe is just and the question of whether it is worth doing your best anyway. The Sumerians answered the first question clearly. No, the universe is not demonstrably just. The righteous suffer. The cruel prosper. The gods have plans that don't include your happiness as a design criterion. And then they answered the second question just as clearly. Yes, it is worth doing your best anyway. Because what else would you do? This is not hope in the conventional sense. Hope implies a future outcome you're betting on. This is something more austere than hope. Something more like decision. The decision to continue, not because continuing is guaranteed to improve things, but because continuing is what you are and what you do and what the clay in you that still carries the memory of divine blood insists upon. There is a Sumerian proverb that goes, "Build like a lord, eat like a king." On the surface, it sounds aspirational. It sounds like the kind of thing you'd put on a motivational wall. But in the context of everything else, Sumerian wisdom literature says about the relationship between effort and reward, between virtue and outcome, between human striving and divine indifference, it reads differently. Build like a lord. Put in the work. Do it as well as it can be done. Not because it will necessarily make you a lord. Not because the universe will reward you proportionately. But because the building itself is the point. Because to build badly, knowing you can build well, would be to betray whatever it is that the divine blood in the clay made you capable of. And eat like a king. Take whatever pleasure the day actually offers. Not the pleasure you were promised. Not the pleasure that is actually there, right now, in front of you. The roasted grain and the date wine and the evening air after the heat is broken, and the sound of your child's voice and the way the canal looks in the last light. Take that. It's real. It's here. The rest, the justice, the reward, the divine guarantee, the rest is not coming. But the grain is real. The evening is real. Take what is actually there. Sumer existed as a recognizable civilization for roughly 1,000 years, from approximately 3,500 to 2000 BCE. 1,000 years is a span of time so vast it barely means anything in human terms. But within that 1,000 years, things happened that the Sumerians experienced not as the inevitable arc of history. They had no concept of history as an arc, as we'll see, but as something more immediate and personal, as failure, as the falling apart of what had been built. This is the crack. Not a single dramatic catastrophe, not one moment of collapse, but a slow accumulation of evidence appearing in the texts across centuries that the system was not holding, that the gods were becoming less responsive, that the divination wasn't working, that the omens could no longer be trusted to mean what they'd always meant. And underneath all of that, a slowly gathering suspicion that this might not be a temporary problem. The city of went through periods of enormous power, and then, around 2000 BCE, was conquered and destroyed by the Elamites and the Amorites. The Great Third Dynasty of the period of its maximum sophistication and cultural achievement, ended not gradually, but sharply, within a generation, and the scribes who watched it happen wrote about it in a literary form that the Sumerians had apparently been developing for this exact purpose: the city lament. If there is a more extraordinary literary genre in the ancient world, I'm not sure what it would be. The city laments are long, formal, literary poems written after the destruction of a major city. Nippur, Eridu, Lagash, in which the patron deity of that city is portrayed as having abandoned it, not been defeated, not failed to protect, abandoned, deliberately, willingly, having been instructed to leave by the higher gods who had decided in their council that this city's time was over. The goddess Ningal, consort of Nana, the moon god, patron of pleads before the council of gods. She begs them not to destroy her city. She argues. She makes her case. The texts preserve her argument in detail, and it is moving precisely because it is so precisely futile. The gods have already decided will fall. Ningal can plead, but she cannot change the decree. And then she leaves. The god leaves the city before the enemy arrives. The destruction is not a defeat, it is an abandonment. And then the lament is written. And in the lament, the goddess cries. She cries for her city. She cries for the people she has left behind. She cries with genuine grief. The texts are unambiguous about this. The divine grief is real and not performative. But she left anyway. She cried, and she left, and the enemy came, and the city burned, and the people scattered. Because the council of the gods had decreed it, and the council of the gods cannot be overruled. Think about what this means as a theology. It means that your city's patron deity loved your city, genuinely loved it, and was unable to save it, not unwilling, unable. Because above the love of a single God for a single city is the administrative authority of the divine council, and that council makes decisions based on principles that have nothing to do with love. The highest authority in the universe is not love. It is decree. It is the me, that Sumerian concept of fundamental principles and divine rules that govern all things, that were established at the beginning and cannot be revised, that exist before any individual god and will exist after any individual god, and before which even the most powerful divine beings must eventually bow. The universe runs on law, not love, and the law doesn't care about you specifically. There is a passage in the lament for the destruction of where the citizens of the city describe what they see after the abandonment. In its lofty gates, where they used to promenade, dead bodies were lying about. In its boulevards, where the feasts used to be celebrated, scattered they lay. In all its streets, where they used to promenade, dead bodies were lying about. In its places, where the festivities of the land used to take place, the people lay in heaps. This is not metaphor. This is not artistic embellishment. This is description. Exact, careful, almost bureaucratic in its precision. The same precision the scribes brought to recording grain deliveries and debt settlements now applied to catastrophe. The boulevards where feasts were held. The streets where people walked. The places where celebrations happened. Now, bodies. There is a quality to this writing that modern readers often find unexpectedly affecting. The Sumerians documented their grief the way they documented everything else, carefully, completely, without flinching, as if the act of precise description was itself a form of respect for what had been lost, as if to say, this was real, these streets were real, we will record them exactly, so that even after everything is gone, the exactness remains. The exactness remains. 4,000 years later, it remains. But something else was cracking, even before the walls of fell. The divination system, the intricate, sophisticated, extensively documented system by which Sumerian specialists read the will of the gods through the examination of animal livers and the behavior of oil poured on water and the movement of birds and the appearance of the stars was beginning to produce results that didn't cohere. Not wrong exactly. The Sumerians didn't think in terms of the system being wrong. The system was correct in principle. The gods communicated through signs. The signs could be read, but the readings required interpretation, and interpretation required judgment. And judgment was human. And humans made errors. And when errors accumulated across enough failed predictions and unexpected outcomes, something very quiet and very fundamental began to shift. Not faith. The Sumerians didn't lose faith in the gods or the system, but something like certainty. Something like the comfortable assumption that if you paid attention carefully enough, if you studied the signs long enough, if you learned the language of the cosmos as thoroughly as it could be learned, then you could know. Then the future would be, if not controllable, at least legible. That assumption began to give way, slowly, without announcement, the way large things give way, not all at once, but grain by grain, like a wall of compressed sand releasing one particle at a time, each individual moment, invisible, the whole only becoming apparent at some point, far past the beginning of the failure. The texts began to reflect this. The later wisdom texts, the ones that belonged to the period when Babylonian culture was absorbing and continuing the Sumerian tradition, are more explicit about the opacity of the divine. They describe the gods as less readable, more distant, their moods less predictable, their favor less reliably earned. The dialogue of pessimism, that extraordinary, deeply strange text in which a master and his servant go back and forth about whether any action is worth taking. And the servant agrees with every position the master takes, and then immediately agrees with its opposite. That text reads like the formal philosophical conclusion of a civilization that has been thinking about this problem for a very long time and has finally decided to write down what it actually believes. Shall I do something for my country? Do it. Then I will do it. What good is helping my country? The feet of your country will run after you. Shall I not do it? Do not do it. The master who has not done it will never go hungry. Back and forth, every action offered, then dissolved, every purpose proposed, then gently, precisely, unfailingly undermined. It is one of the oldest satires ever written. It is also a genuine philosophical document. And it was written not in despair, but you can feel this in the precision and even the wit of the writing, with a kind of tired, clear-eyed, almost affectionate acceptance of its own conclusions. Nothing is definitively worth doing. Nothing is definitively not worth doing. The universe does not provide a stable basis for choosing. And yet here we are, writing it down. The crack in the Sumerian world was not the fall of a city or the failure of a dynasty. Those were the visible surfaces of something deeper. The crack was the gradual, cumulative discovery that the system, the entire intricate system of ritual and omens and personal gods and temple offerings and proper conduct and civic order, could not in the end fully close the gap between human need and cosmic indifference. The system was good. The system was the best system anyone had built. The Sumerians knew this and were rightly proud of it. But the gap was always there. The gap was always larger than the system. And at some point in the long afternoon of their civilization, the scribes and priests and poets who thought most carefully about these things began to write. Not about how to close the gap, but about how to live with it. This is the moment when Sumerian wisdom literature, already old, already sophisticated, already carrying centuries of careful thinking, becomes something that we, sitting here in the dark, 4,000 years later, can read and feel, not as history, as recognition. There was a flood. There is always a flood in the ancient world. But the Sumerian flood, the one that predates the biblical account, the one preserved in the Epic of Atrahasis, and in fragments that would eventually feed into the story of Gilgamesh, is different from the flood you might know. It is different in one specific, crucial way. In the Sumerian flood story, the gods don't send the flood because of human wickedness. They don't send it as punishment for moral failure. The gods send the flood, and Lil specifically orders it because humanity has become too numerous and too loud. The land had grown wide. The people had become many. The land bellowed like a wild bull. The god grew disturbed at their noise, and Lil heard their clamor and said, "The noise of mankind has become too great. I cannot sleep for their uproar." Read that again. The god sends a flood to destroy most of humanity because he cannot sleep. Not because humans were evil, not because they had violated divine law, because they were loud, because there were too many of them, because the sheer noise of human life, its density, its persistence, its relentless animal energy, was disturbing the divine rest. You could read this as monstrous, and it is, a little. A god who would drown most of humanity because he wants quiet is not a god who is on your side. But you could also read it as something else, something more honest. It is the admission that the universe was not designed around human comfort, that the cosmos did not arrange itself to accommodate the noise of human life, that we are, from a cosmic perspective, perhaps a bit much, a bit persistent, a bit loud, a bit more here than anyone above us planned for, and that the universe, on occasion, pushes back. Not because you've done anything wrong, just because you're here. Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah, the man who survived the flood by building a great boat on Enki's secret instruction, did not emerge from this story as a hero in the way we might expect. He survived. He preserved the seed of life. He completed what he was instructed to do, and his reward was immortality, but a specific, almost ironic form of immortality. Enlil, furious that any humans had survived his flood, was persuaded by Enki to grant Utnapishtim and his wife eternal life, but only if they went to live at the mouth of the rivers, at the edge of the world, far from the land of the living. Immortality at the edge of the world, away from everything. You survived. You live forever, but you do it out there, removed, apart, in the place where the rivers end and the world runs out. Even the Sumerian reward for perfect conduct is exile. Gilgamesh, the great hero, the king of Uruk, two-thirds divine, the man who built the walls of the greatest city in the world, went looking for Utnapishtim after his beloved friend Enkidu died. Not looking for wisdom, exactly. Looking for what Utnapishtim had, immortality. A way out of the one thing that the walls of Uruk and the strength of Gilgamesh's divine heritage and the favor of the gods could not prevent: death. He made his way through darkness and scorpion men and the waters of death and found the old man at the edge of the world. He asked his question. He asked for the secret, and Utnapishtim told him a truth that is one of the quietest and most devastating in all of ancient literature. He said, and here I'm paraphrasing from a translation, 4,000 years old and filtered through cuneiform and clay. He said, when the gods created humanity, they kept life for themselves and gave death to humans. You, Gilgamesh, Fill your belly. Day and night, dance and be merry. Feast and rejoice. Let your clothes be fresh and clean. Bathe yourself in water. Cherish the little child who holds your hand. Let your wife delight in your embrace. These things are the task of mankind. Dance and be merry. Bathe yourself. Hold the child's hand. Let your wife delight in you. These things, these small, immediate, sensory, unremarkable things, are the task of mankind. Not glory, not the defeat of death, not the resolution of the cosmic injustice, the bathing, the clean clothes, the small, warm hand. Gilgamesh didn't take the advice. He kept looking. He found a plant at the bottom of the sea, a plant of rejuvenation, the Sumerians' version of the elixir, thorny and difficult to obtain. He pulled it up. He held it in his hands, this impossible thing that he'd traveled to the edge of the world to find. And a serpent stole it from him while he slept. He woke up, and the plant was gone, and the serpent, newly rejuvenated, shedding its old skin in the reeds, slithered away. Gilgamesh sat down on the bank of the water and wept. And then he went home. He went back to Uruk, and he walked its walls, the walls he had built, the enormous, enduring, beautiful walls. And the text tells us that he showed them to the ferryman who had brought him back. Look at this, he said. Look at the walls. Look at what was built. That's the ending. Not resolution, not peace, not the thing he went looking for. Just look at the walls. Look at what we made. The walls are still here, and I made them. And someday they too will fall. But right now they are here, and I am here, and the day is here. That's all. That's the whole ending of the world's oldest epic poem. That's what Sumer has to say about the search for meaning. Look at what we made. The most disorienting thing about the Sumerian understanding of the world is not how foreign it is. It is how familiar. You have felt, at some point, probably at many points, the thing the Sumerian wisdom texts describe. The thing where you've done everything correctly, and the outcome is still wrong. The thing where the system you're embedded in, the economic system, the social system, the physical reality of bodies and time, that system is simply not organized around your needs. The thing where you pray in whatever form prayer takes for you, and the answer doesn't come. Not because you did it wrong, just because it didn't come. The Sumerians had a name for this condition. They called it life. But there is something more specific in the Sumerian texts that I want to stay with for a moment, because it is easy to miss and it changes everything. The Sumerians did not believe the universe was malevolent. This is the distinction. Cruelty would imply that the universe is paying attention to you and choosing to cause you pain. The Sumerian cosmos is not like that. It is not against you. It is simply, and this is perhaps more difficult to accept than outright cruelty, not particularly about you. But gods have their business. The councils of heaven have their decisions. Fate has its structure, its architecture of decree and counter-decree, its elaborate bureaucracy that was old before humanity was made. And you move through this structure subject to its operations, lit by its occasional attention, darkened by its frequent inattention, and nothing that happens to you, neither the good nor the bad, was specifically arranged with you in mind. The me, the divine decrees that structure existence, include kingship and priesthood and descent to the underworld and the crafts of the smith and the scribe and the prostitute and the musician. They include truth and falsehood, descent and ascent. the arts of war and of peace, the garment of the old woman, and the strength of the hero. They are not moral categories. They are structural categories. They are the furniture of the universe. And you are a person who happens to live in a universe that has this particular furniture. The chair is not against you. The wall is not against you. The cold floor in the morning is not against you. It is simply cold. What the Sumerians did with this understanding, what is genuinely remarkable, genuinely extraordinary about this civilization, is that they did not stop building. They kept building. They built cities on land that required constant, exhausting maintenance to be livable. They dug canals that flooded and needed to be dug again. They built temples to gods who they knew, whose wisdom literature explicitly said could not be fully trusted to answer. They educated their children in schools where the teachers beat them, and the curriculum was brutal. And the exam that mattered most was the one that opened doors to a better life that was still, in the end, a life subject to flood and disease and conquest and the cold gray democracy of the underworld. They kept writing. The scribes pressed their styluses into wet clay every day, recording the grain and the debts and the omens and the laments and the proverbs and the love songs and the arguments between the seasons and the stories of the gods. They wrote things that were true and difficult and unpleasant to say, and they pressed them into clay, and the clay dried and became stone, essentially, became a permanence that was never planned for. And so those words are still here, still legible, still doing what they were always doing, which is telling you something honest about what it is to be alive. There is a Sumerian love poem, one of the oldest love poems in the world, that describes a young woman dressing for her beloved, putting on her finest clothes and her jewels and anticipating the arrival of the king. It is joyful, unambiguously, physically, directly joyful. The kind of joy that doesn't require a cosmic framework, that doesn't need the universe's approval, that exists entirely in the warm room with the oil lamp and the good dress and the waiting. That poem exists in the same culture that produced the dialogue of pessimism and the lament for the destruction of Ur and the man and his god and the story of Gilgamesh sitting on the bank, weeping over his stolen plant. Both are true. Both are Sumerian. Both are made from the same clay, pressed by the same hands, dried in the same sun. The joy and the despair are not in contradiction. They are the same recognition. Inanna descended to the underworld, the great goddess, the most powerful female deity in the Sumerian pantheon, the goddess of love and war and beauty and politics and desire, the queen of heaven herself, chose to descend to the realm of the dead, to the domain of her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the great below. We don't entirely know why. The texts are ambiguous about her motivation, which may be intentional. Some things don't have entirely clear motivations, and perhaps the scribes knew this. Maybe she went to attend a funeral. Maybe she went to expand her power. Maybe she went because the underworld existed, and she could not fully be the goddess of everything while there was a domain of existence she had not entered. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, she was stripped of something: her crown, her earrings, her necklace of lapis lazuli, her breastplate, her golden ring, her measuring rod, her garment. Article by article, gate by gate, she descended until she arrived before her sister, naked and bereft of every external marker of her power. And Ereshkigal, who was not cruel exactly, but was also not kind, who was simply the ruler of the place all things come to eventually, and whose rules cannot be broken even by the Queen of Heaven, Ereshkigal looked at her sister and condemned her to death. Inanna died, was hung on a hook, a corpse in the underworld. The world above began to fail. Without the goddess of love and fertility, nothing grew, nothing reproduced, nothing mated, nothing was renewed. The world above began to slowly gray out, to lose its impetus, to go through the motions without the animating force that had always moved through it. After 3 days, because Inanna had been wise enough to make arrangements before she descended, to set in motion a rescue plan with her servant Ninshubur, she was revived. She rose. She ascended back through the 7 gates, reclaiming each article of clothing and each ornament as she went, returning by degrees to herself. But the law of the underworld holds. Nothing leaves the land of no return without sending a substitute. Someone had to take Inanna's place. She came back to the world, and the world, which had been holding its breath, which had been gray and cold and waiting, the world came back to life around her. Things grew. Things mated. The color returned. But someone else went down. The return is always paid for by a departure. This, too, is a Sumerian understanding so fundamental it appears in their mythology of the gods themselves, not just in human life, not just in the grain cycle or the seasons, in the divine. Even the Queen of Heaven, when she returns from death, brings death with her. Not as punishment, as the price of the transaction. The universe keeps its accounts. Joy costs something. Return costs something. Even the survival of the world costs someone their life. This is not pessimism, exactly. Pessimism assumes the world could be otherwise and is failing to be. The Sumerian view is different. It assumes this is simply how transactions work at the cosmic level. The price is not unfair. It is the actual price, the actual exchange rate between life and death, between the world above and the world below. Knowing the price does not make it lighter, but it makes it less surprising. There is one more thing to say about the Sumerian experience of the world before we move into the long, quiet stretch of the night. The Sumerians were the first people to feel, and to record feeling, the specific vertigo of living in a civilization. What I mean is this: before cities, before writing, before the accumulation of systems and knowledge and records and laws and debts, before all of that, a human life was comprehensible in a certain way. The scale of what you knew matched the scale of what you needed to know. Your world was your valley, your tribe, your season, your survival. The Sumerians changed that. They built cities. They created writing. They accumulated knowledge on an unprecedented scale. They established systems so complex that no one person could fully understand them. Not the king, not the high priest, not the most learned scribe. The city was larger than any individual mind. The history was longer than any individual life. The debts went back generations. The laws had been made by people who were now dead. The gods were being served in temples whose construction no living person had witnessed. For the first time in human history, people lived inside systems they could not fully comprehend. And they felt it. The wisdom literature of Sumer is full of a very specific anxiety. Not the anxiety of physical danger, not the fear of the flood or the enemy army, but the anxiety of incomprehensibility, of living inside something too large to see, of being subject to forces you can observe in their effects but never fully trace to their source, of debt and decree and divine will and civic obligation all interweaving in patterns too dense to follow, all making claims on you simultaneously, none of them reducible to anything simple. This is the anxiety of civilization, and we know it very well, because we live in a civilization too, one that is larger and more complex than by orders of magnitude that strain the imagination, one in which the systems that govern daily life, economic, political, technological, social, are so intricate and so interconnected that no one fully understands them, one in which you can do everything correctly and still find yourself caught in the gears of something you never signed up for. That was built by people you never knew, according to principles that were never fully explained to you. The Sumerian scribe, pressing his clay tablet, worried about the temple's accounts and the gods' inattention and the coming flood. You lie in the dark at the end of a day and worry about things that are structurally very similar, just larger, faster, and significantly better lit. The worry is the same. The smallness of the individual inside the enormity of the system is the same. The gap between what you can control and what controls you is the same. The Sumerians were the first people to live inside this gap. They didn't close it, they wrote about it. They pressed it into clay and let it dry, and stored it in jars and buried it under the rubble of cities that fell and rose and fell again. And 4,000 years later, someone dug it up and translated it and published it. And now you and I are sitting here in the dark with it, recognizing it the way you recognize a face that is somehow familiar, even though you have never met. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has no good cure, not the tiredness of a long day or a bad night or a season of overwork. That tiredness has a remedy: rest, sleep, time, the simple biological mercy of the body shutting down and rebuilding itself in the dark. That tiredness is honest and solvable, and in some ways almost pleasant, the way a sore muscle is almost pleasant because it is proof of something real. The tiredness, I mean, is different. It is the tiredness of carrying a question that has no answer, of living inside an uncertainty that cannot be resolved by any effort or information or cleverness, of being a conscious creature in a universe that is not, as far as anyone can tell, conscious back. The Sumerians called this, in various texts and in various ways, the burden of the me, the burden of being subject to the decrees that structure existence. Not the burden of a specific suffering, not illness, not loss, not debt, but the prior burden, the ontological one, the one that precedes all the specific problems and underlies all of them. The burden of knowing you are mortal and small, and that the universe is not arranged around your needs. This is the oldest existential weight in recorded history, and it is exactly the weight you are lying with right now, in one form or another. If you are honest about what the dark brings up when the day is finally quiet enough to let it surface. We tend to think of existential anxiety as a modern problem, a product of secularization perhaps, of the death of the old certainties, of a world that no longer has a coherent religious framework to absorb the terror of consciousness and mortality and meaninglessness. We diagnose it as something that happened to us, specifically because of specific historical developments that stripped away the structures that used to manage it. But the Sumerians had all the structures. They had religion, deeply and genuinely. They had community, tightly woven. They had cosmology, a detailed, sophisticated, coherent account of what the universe was and how it worked and where humans fit within it. They had ritual, constant and precise and demanding. They had the temple, the city, the king, the god, and they still felt it. The texts are unambiguous. They still felt the specific cold of the question underneath all the structures. They still, in the honest hours, knew that the structures were human-made and therefore finite and therefore unable to fully close the gap between the individual consciousness and the enormous indifferent fact of existence. This is not a modern problem. This is the oldest problem. We didn't invent it. We inherited it, along with writing and cities and the wheel and the calendar and debt. But here is the thing that the Sumerian texts suggest and that I find myself returning to with something that feels close to gratitude. The structures help anyway, not because they close the gap, not because they answer the question, but because they give the body something to do while the mind sits with the unanswerable. Because the ritual of a temple, even if the god doesn't respond, requires you to get up in the morning and dress and walk across the city and stand in the courtyard and say the words. Because the canal needs to be maintained whether or not the universe is paying attention. Because the child needs feeding whether or not the cosmos has a plan for the child. The structures give you something to do, and doing, not achieving, not succeeding, not resolving, but the plain activity of doing is its own answer, not to the question of why, but to the question of how to get through the day. The Sumerians built the structures knowing they were incomplete. They maintained the rituals knowing the gods might not be listening. They wrote the laments knowing the city wouldn't be rebuilt by the writing of laments. They pressed the proverbs into clay, knowing the clay could be shattered, the city could fall, the river could change its course and leave the whole endeavor literally stranded in the desert. They did it anyway, not out of hope, out of something more durable than hope, out of the decision to be the kind of creature that does things, even in the face of the evidence. There is a question that Sumerian wisdom literature asks in various forms, across many texts. What is good for a man? It appears in the dialogue of pessimism. It appears in variations in the proverbs, in the laments, in the philosophical reflections that the later Babylonian inheritors of Sumerian culture kept writing and revising and expanding upon. What is good for a man? What does it mean for a life to have gone well? The answers vary. They are sometimes cynical. Eat, drink, make the most of the day, because tomorrow is uncertain and the gods don't consult you. They are sometimes more complex. Tend your relationships, do your work with care. Maintain your obligations to the temple and the city and the family. They are sometimes genuinely moving. Be present with the people you love, because the time is short and the underworld does not have much to recommend it. But the question itself is the remarkable thing. The fact that someone 4,000 years ago, in a city made of mud on a flat, hot plain between two rivers that flooded without permission, sat down and asked it, formally, carefully, with the seriousness of a scribe, making a record of something that matters. What is good for a man? Not, what will the gods do for me? Not, how do I earn my reward? Not, what is the correct path to a happy life? Those questions assume an answer exists that's externally provided, cosmically guaranteed, available to the person who works hard enough and believes the right things. The Sumerian question is different. It assumes the answer is something you construct, not receive, something you work out, not discover, something that has to be decided with whatever wisdom you have in the middle of a life that is genuinely uncertain and a universe that is genuinely not oriented toward your happiness. What is good for a man? What would you say? Not the official answer, not the answer that sounds right in the daylight with people listening. The real answer, the one that lives in the quiet part of your mind that only speaks when everything else is still. You don't have to answer tonight. The question is just there. The Sumerians put it into words before anyone else did, and it has been there ever since. Patient and unanswerable, and somehow strangely comforting in the way that a very honest question is always comforting, even when, especially when, it has no good answer. Let me tell you about a scribe. We don't know his name. He worked probably in the temple complex at Nippur, sometime around 2000 BCE. He was educated in the Aduba, the tablet house, and he was good at his work. The tablets associated with what scholars believe may be a single scribal tradition show a consistent quality of attention, a care with the clay, a precision in the wedge marks that suggests someone who took the work seriously. He copied texts. This was the core of a scribe's work, not original composition exactly, but the careful reproduction and preservation of the existing body of literature. You copied the hymns, the laments, the proverbs, the administrative records, the astronomical observations, the omens. You copied them accurately, in the correct order, using the correct signs. And in doing so, you became the medium through which the past kept existing. Without the scribes, nothing survives. We have what we have of Sumerian civilization: the hymns, the love poems, the laments, the proverbs, the creation myths, the story of Gilgamesh, only because someone sat at a tablet and pressed the marks in and let it dry. The anonymous scribe at Nippur, copying texts he had probably already copied dozens of times, was doing something he may not have fully thought about in these terms. He was making a decision about what deserved to continue. Every text you copy is a text you decided matters enough to preserve. Every tablet you fire and store is a vote for continuity, a small, practical, daily act of refusing to let things go entirely. He didn't know, of course, that his tablets would be buried under millennia of sediment and excavated by 19th century archaeologists and translated into German and English and French and Japanese, and eventually exist online, where anyone can read them. He had no reason to think in those terms. He was doing his job, maintaining the system, keeping the records, and yet here we are, you in the dark, 4,000 years later, with the words he copied moving through your mind like water through a canal. Quiet, continuous, carrying something from somewhere so far back it barely has a shape anymore, arriving somehow here. This is what writing is. This is what writing has always been. Not a monument, not a triumph, just a canal, a channel dug with considerable effort through difficult ground, designed to carry something from where it is to where it needs to be. The scribe dug his channel. The water is still moving. There is something that modern psychology has a name for: mortality salience, the technical term for the specific way that awareness of death changes behavior, changes thinking, changes what you decide to care about and work toward. When you are reminded that you will die, something shifts. Studies show, and this is a finding that has been replicated enough to take seriously, that mortality salience makes people cling more tightly to the things that give them a sense of meaning and continuity. Their culture, their relationships, their legacy, their beliefs. The Sumerians lived with mortality salience as a permanent condition. They didn't need to be reminded. It was in the texts they memorized in school, in the myths they heard from childhood, in the proverbs that structured their thinking, in the fact of the underworld that waited for everyone impartially at the end of every life. Death was not a subject they occasionally confronted. It was the permanent backdrop against which everything else happened. And the result was not, as you might expect, paralysis, not the inability to build or love or work or plan. The result was, if anything, the opposite, an unusual, almost fierce engagement with the present, a tendency to document everything, to record everything, to treat the daily facts of life, the grain delivery, the labor contract, the love poem, the school complaint, as things worth pressing permanently into clay. This happened. This was real. We were here. We don't have a word for what the Sumerians did with their awareness of mortality. We might call it urgent fidelity to the real, the commitment to treating what is actually happening right now with the full weight of attention it deserves, precisely because you know, clearly, without illusion, that it will end. The city will fall. The gods will look away. The canal will silt up, and the walls will crumble, and the sand will cover everything, and no one will remember. All of this is known. All of this is already written, already pressed into clay, already part of the permanent record of the honest understanding. And so, the grain is real. The evening is real. The child's hand is real. The canal in the last light is real. Take it. It's here. What I find myself thinking about in the long hours of the night when the day has finally released me and the room is dark and the thoughts that have been waiting all day for the noise to stop begin to move, what I find myself thinking about is the flatness of Mesopotamia, not as a metaphor, as a physical fact. The land between the rivers is almost perfectly flat for hundreds of miles. There are no mountains, no significant hills, no natural features that would tell you where you are relative to anything else. The horizon is the same in every direction. The sky is very large. The human structures, the walls of the city, the ziggurat, the palm groves, the irrigation canals running in their straight lines, are the only vertical things, and they are small against the sky. This is the world the Sumerians woke up into every morning. A world where the sky was enormous, and the horizon was everywhere, and the human things were small, and they built anyway. They built the ziggurat to bring the sky closer, to give the god a mountain in a land that had no mountains, to make something vertical and permanent in a place that was horizontal and temporary. They built the walls of Ur not just for defense, but because walls define a thing. Give it edges, make it knowable, make it theirs in a way the flat, undifferentiated plain never could be. They built the tablet house and the canal system and the temple storehouse and the legal code, not because the universe required it, but because they required it. Because the human mind, dropped into the enormous indifferent flatness of the world, insists on making structure, on drawing lines, on pressing marks into soft material and letting it harden into permanence. This is not optimism. This is something more interesting than optimism. This is the instinct that persists after optimism has been replaced by clear sight. The instinct that says, the sky is too large and the horizon is too far, and nothing I build will last, and the gods are not reliably listening, and I will die and be forgotten, and the sand will cover everything. And yet I am going to build the canal now because the field needs water. Maybe this is the oldest form of meaning there is. Not the meaning that comes from believing things will work out. not the meaning that is granted from outside, from the universe or the gods or the cosmic plan, but the meaning that is manufactured moment by moment by the decision to continue being the kind of creature that does things. You get up before you want to. You do the work the day requires. You tend the canal that will need tending again tomorrow. You press the marks into the clay with care, even though the tablet might be broken, even though the language might become unreadable, even though the city might fall and the sand might cover the archive and the whole record might be lost for thousands of years before someone with a brush and a lantern finds it buried in the rubble. You press the marks carefully anyway, because you are here and the clay is here, and this is what you are. The Sumerians didn't call this philosophy. They didn't need to. It was just how they lived. They pressed it into tablets without labeling it, preserved it without announcing it, built on it without marking it as a foundation. It was simply the way things were done in a world where the way things were done had been tested against flood and drought and conquest and divine silence, and had, so far, as all things continue, until they don't. The night is deep now, wherever you are, in a room lit or dark, in a city or somewhere quieter, in a life that is going well enough or a life that is going through something difficult. The night is deep, and the question is still there. The Sumerian question, 4,000 years old, patient as clay. What is good for a man? I won't answer it for you. I'm not sure anyone can. But I want to offer one last thing the Sumerian texts give us before the silence settles in completely, and the words stop, and the night does what night does. The Sumerians knew, as clearly as they knew anything, that they would be forgotten. Cities fall, languages die. The gods themselves in the Sumerian texts are described as having ages, as growing old, as eventually being replaced or superseded or simply ceasing to be invoked. Nothing lasts. The Sumerians knew this not abstractly, but practically. They had already seen it. Cities they knew had been great were ruins. Languages their grandparents had known were already being replaced. The world was already moving on from them, even while they were still in it. And they found, in this knowledge, not despair, but a strange, quiet tenderness. A tenderness toward the things that exist right now, precisely because right now is the only time they exist. The canal in the last light, the city settling into evening, the reed warbler somewhere in the papyrus, making its small repeated sound, the child asleep on the flat roof, the stars, enormous and indifferent and extraordinarily beautiful, the god in his temple, attended and fed and clothed, not answering, the scribe at his tablet, pressing marks into wet clay, making something that will harden. All of it temporary, all of it real. The city of is sleeping, not the of kings and dynasties and trade routes and temple politics. That is long gone, covered by sand and excavated and photographed, and put into museum cases and academic papers and books that sit on shelves in universities in countries that did not exist when was alive. The is smaller than that. Just the city, just the night, the flat, dark land between the rivers, under a sky so thick with stars it would stop you if you looked at it too directly. The canal moving in the dark without sound. The walls of the houses warm with the stored heat of the day, releasing it slowly into the air, warming the alleys that are empty now, that will be full again tomorrow, when the day begins its cycle again. The ziggurat stands at the city's heart. From a distance, from the edge of the flatland, from the place where the canals end and the desert begins, it looks small. The human thing, the vertical thing, the mountain built in a land without mountains. From a distance, you can see both the ziggurat and the sky at the same time, and you understand immediately, without needing to think about it, the difference in scale. The sky is everywhere. The ziggurat is a specific, finite, carefully made point in it. Small, real, still there. Inside the houses, the people of are dreaming. We can't know what they dreamed. Dreams are not pressed into clay mostly, or if they were, they haven't survived in the same quantities as the grain records and the debt tablets and the love poems. But they dreamed. The same bodies, the same nervous systems, the same electrochemical processes that produce your dreams in the dark produced theirs. The farmer dreaming about the canal, the scribe dreaming about the marks he pressed all day, still moving in his hands even in sleep, the mother dreaming about the child, as mothers always dream about their children, with a specific quality of attention that doesn't stop when consciousness does. The merchant on his boat, on the river, rocking slightly on the dark water, dreaming about the place he's going, or the place he left, or neither. Just the water, just the movement, just the dark. Everyone dreaming their specific, unrepeatable, unrecorded dream, and the city holding all of it, containing all of it. The walls and the canals and the alleys and the archive and the temple with its attended god. The whole intricate, fragile, human-made structure holding the sleepers inside it, keeping the desert out, giving the dreams a place to happen. This is what cities are for. This, more than anything else, a structure within which the small, specific, mortal things can happen. A boundary drawn against the enormous, indifferent flatness. Not a permanent boundary, not an invincible one, but a real one. For now, tonight, while the stars burn and the canal moves, and the reed warbler has gone silent, and the day has not yet decided to return. Real. For now. The last scribe in the archive is almost done. He has been working later than usual. The lamp beside him, a small clay bowl of sesame oil with a twisted reed for a wick, is low. The flame smaller than it was an hour ago. The circle of light it throws around him, shrinking slightly as the oil is consumed. In the corner of the archive room, shelves of clay tablets stand in their rows. Some are old enough that the clay has taken on the dark color of great age, the marks on them worn but legible to a trained eye. Others are recent, still pale, still sharp-edged, the wedge marks crisp in the lamplight. He is copying a hymn. He has copied this hymn before. He will probably copy it again. It is a hymn to Inanna, one of the great hymns attributed to the high priestess Enheduanna, who lived 150 years before this scribe was born, who was the daughter of a king and the first named author in human history, the first person whose name we know who wrote something down that was meant to be preserved. The first author. Her name was Enheduanna. She wrote hymns to Inanna that described the goddess with a directness and an intimacy that is still startling. Not distant, reverential description, but something more like a relationship. A complicated, demanding, loving, sometimes frightened relationship with a divine force that she addressed as you. You, she wrote. Not she, not the goddess. You. As if the goddess were in the room, as if writing you could make it so. The scribe copies the word, presses it, carefully. The mark is small and precise, a cuneiform sign for the second person singular, 4,000 years old by the time you see it in translation, and still pointing, still aimed at something, still insisting on the proximity of the divine, even in the dark, even when the lamp is low, even when the answer hasn't come in a long time. You. He finishes the tablet, sets it aside to dry, looks at the lamp, which has very little oil left, looks at the rows of tablets in the room around him. All these preserved words, all this careful record of what was believed and felt and observed and feared and loved. He does not know that the city will fall. Or perhaps he does. Perhaps the omens have been unclear for some time. Perhaps the diviner's report last week was troubling. The oil spreading in a pattern that the specialists found ambiguous. The kind of ambiguity that is worse than a clear bad sign, because at least a clear bad sign tells you what to do. But ambiguity just leaves you with the question. He puts out the lamp. The archive room goes dark. The tablets are still there in the dark, in their rows, holding everything they hold, the grain records and the debt settlements and the astronomical observations and the hymns to Inanna and the laments for fallen cities and the proverbs about poverty and wealth and the questions that have no good answers and the love poems and the school complaints and the careful, patient, undefeated writing of people who knew the sky was too large and built anyway in the dark. All of this exists, waiting, the way things wait in the dark, not anxiously, not purposefully, but with the simple, absolute patience of things that have been made well and have nowhere to go. Outside, the city breathes. The canal moves. The river, far to the west, moves with its ancient indifference. The stars burn in their thousands, in the enormous dark above the flat land, and none of them are watching. And all of them are there. Somewhere near the wall, a dog makes a brief sound and then goes quiet. A child turns over in sleep. The ziggurat stands at the center of the city, its summit in the dark. The god within it attended, but not answering, as gods so often are, as gods have always been, as gods perhaps can only be, present in the structure, in the ritual, in the decision to build a temple in the first place, in the word you pressed into clay by a woman who was the first person to sign her name to something she made. Not present in the way we want presence, not answering in the way we want answers, but there, in the structure, in the work, in the canal that carries the water, in the walls that hold the dark at bay for one more night. You are tired. Not just tonight tired. The other tired. The tired that comes from being conscious and responsible and uncertain and alive in a world that is too large and too complicated and too relentlessly itself to ever quite fit inside any one person's understanding of it. That tired. The Sumerians were that tired too. They built their cities in it. They dug their canals in it. They pressed their marks into clay in it. Careful and precise, because the work deserved care regardless of how tired you were. And the care was its own answer to the tiredness, the only answer that actually worked. You don't have to build anything tonight. You don't have to answer the question tonight. You don't have to close the gap or resolve the uncertainty or figure out what it all means or decide what is good for a person or find the plant at the bottom of the sea that the serpent will steal from you. While you sleep, tonight you can just be the warm animal that you are, in the warm room, in the dark, with the day behind you and the night around you. The city is sleeping. The canal moves. The reed warbler is quiet. The scribe has put out his lamp. And somewhere, under all the centuries of sand and silence, the tablets are still there, still holding the words, still patient, still aimed with that strange, tender precision at whoever will eventually be in the dark when they finally surface, at you. You, the word still points, the clay still holds, the night is still here, doing what the night does, taking the world gently out of your hands for a few hours, promising nothing, guaranteeing nothing, but offering this one reliable thing: the silence, the dark, the soft animal mercy of sleep. Go ahead, let it come. The city will still be there in the morning. It always is, until it isn't. But tonight it is. And that, the oldest human writing quietly insists, from 4,000 years of patient clay, is enough. That is exactly enough.